we have to stop moralizing in the West about corruption being something that happens over there in Ukraine, Russia, whatever, and that we are the good guys and they are the bad guys. This is simply both morally wrong and perverse. It's perverse because corruption in places like Ukraine, Russia, and the former USSR could not exist without the avenues for facilitating that corruption also existing in the West. This includes obviously banks. To give one example, oligarch Ihor Kolomoyskyi is now wanted by Ukraine for laundering $5.5 billion over the last decade through Privat Bank, which was nationalized by the Ukrainian government a couple of years ago. That money laundering could not have taken place without the assistance of Western banks. That in particular includes Cyprus, Latvia, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Austria, London, of course, and probably elsewhere. They're all culpable in this. So corruption in Ukraine cannot exist, it's not profitable, it's not worthwhile without the assistance of Western banks. Even more so, a lot of the finger pointing today is that corruption is not being is not really a priority for Ukrainian leaders, and that we need therefore an anti-corruption court. I'm all in favor of an anti-corruption court, all in favor of Ukraine's elites being equal before the law and accountable for their actions. But there's no point in setting up an anti-corruption court if Ukrainians who are wanted to put on trial flee to Europe or elsewhere, and there they're given political asylum. And there are many examples of that. Firtash is being held back from either deportation to Spain, where he's wanted for money laundering with organized crime, Russian organized crime, by the way, Dmytro Firtash, and is wanted by the US for corruption. He's not being held back by Ukrainian courts, but by Austrian courts. Onyshchenko has fled from Ukraine. He's also wanted for corruption in the gas sector. Kolomoyskyi, I just mentioned, is living in one of his palaces on Lake Geneva in Switzerland, because he has 3 passports, illegally, of course, Ukraine, Swiss, and Israeli. And another Ukrainian official who headed the Ukrainian Arms Export Agency under Yushchenko fled to Britain, where he was given asylum recently. And I know the person who wrote the expert report for the British lawyer that got him that asylum. He works at the Chatham House think tank in London, a think tank that criticizes corruption in Ukraine. And on the other hand, the people who work at Chatham House also write reports for lawyers permitting those people who have undertaken corruption to flee to Britain and get asylum there. Contradiction? Well, it's not the only contradiction that exists in this. Another example is particularly the Ukrainian American diaspora. Washington, as we know from Donald Trump's many tweets, is a swamp. But it's not just a swamp for people like Paul Manafort and other US political consultants. Yes, they have long been involved in various sort of ways of taking dirty money from places like the Ukraine when it was ruled by Viktor Yanukovych. But Paul Manafort and Viktor Yanukovych didn't just give money to Republicans, which is what, if you watch CNN, it seems it's just the Republicans are at fault. Under Yanukovych, dirty money went to Washington to Democrats, to Republicans, and to the Ukrainian American diaspora, all 3 groups. One of the groups from the Democrats' side, for example, was the Podesta consultancy group. The brother of the head of Podesta was the head of Hillary Clinton's election campaign. 2 Podestas. One took money from Yanukovych, the other one headed Hillary Clinton's election campaign. So it's not just Trump, it's the other side as well. But under Yanukovych, a number of groups in Washington took money from him, from the Ukrainian diaspora. The US American Foundation, for example, a very well-known group in Washington, which now runs an NGO called Friends of Ukraine in Washington, which continually talks about and complains about corruption in Ukraine, has been holding annual sort of Ukraine galas or Ukraine events each year in Washington, D.C. They took money from Akhmetov, the Klyuyev brothers, very close allies of Viktor Yanukovych, throughout Yanukovych's presidency. In fact, they took money even after Tymoshenko and Lutsenko were put in prison. Let's remember that. So they didn't stop. That wasn't a sort of a red line for them. They continued taking money even after those two political opposition leaders went to jail. The last amount of money they took was for a Ukrainian annual gala event in Washington, which was held in December 2013, ironically during the Euromaidan. So I'm sorry, but the Ukrainian American and the Friends of Ukraine NGO have no right to complain about corruption in Ukraine if they themselves were happy to take money from the mafioso regime of Viktor Yanukovych. Just a few weeks ago, I was in Kiev and I had an interview with Yuri Lutsenko, the Prosecutor General of Ukraine. He told me that under Yanukovych, $40 billion was stolen. That's more than the annual Ukrainian state budget. So money that was given to these various groups, Democrats, Republicans, and Ukrainian Americans, was stolen from the Ukrainian people and from the Ukrainian budget. It wasn't just that particular group, which was rather unusual because this is a group that's been around for a long time in Washington. It's been very active in Ukraine, and very strange that they took money from Yanukovych. But it's all down to this question of, the problem is over there, not with me. The problem is that way. Look for corruption elsewhere. Don't look at it for me. I'm clean. Well, you're not clean if you take dirty money. And I was always therefore critical of the Ukrainian American diaspora, and in particular here, UKK was heavily involved in this, in taking $2 million to pay for a monument to the victims of the Holodomor, which went up in Washington, D.C. I think that it was wrong to do that. Setting aside that it was wrong, it was also wrong because it came from the worst oligarch in Ukraine, Dmytro Firtash, who I've mentioned, he's sort of under house arrest in the Ritz Hotel, very nice location for to be under house arrest in Vienna, awaiting extradition either to Spain or the US. It's completely ironic that Ukrainian Americans take money from somebody who was accused by the American government of corruption to pay for a monument to the Holodomor. I'm sorry, but that to me sounds rather perverse. And Firtash isn't just a crooked oligarch. The Spanish charges against him are for him being involved in money laundering with Russian organized crime. So this is one step removed. This is not just an oligarch, sort of like from the city of London, shall we say, a white-collar crime person who fiddles the books. This is one step removed, one step worse. But also Firtash is the most pro-Russian of these oligarchs. He's from the gas lobby that was always in bed with Vladimir Putin. When they received cheap gas from Russia, as they did under Yanukovych, there was a reason for that. The Ukrainian government was charged over $400 per 1,000 cubic meters for gas, the highest gas price in Europe. Firtash was getting that same gas at about $250. He was then selling it on, making a huge profit, and putting that money into buying sectors of the Ukrainian economy on behalf of Russia. He was a Russian agent. There's a very long Reuters investigation into how this entire, as it were, scheme was played out. So, okay, the Ukrainian American diaspora took $2 million from Firtash. Well, if you've taken that money, then sit quiet. You have no moral right to complain about corruption in Ukraine and start wagging your fingers about corruption in Ukraine if you've taken corrupt money yourselves from Ukraine. You can't do both things at the same time. You can't complain about corruption and be involved in taking corrupt money. It's simply immoral and hypocritical. And so therefore, it's now, of course, too late to probably return that $2 million. You can't take the monument down anymore. So therefore, I would recommend that just sit quiet and no longer complain about corruption in Ukraine, because you've lost the moral right to do that. And that's true as well in general in the West. The fight against corruption in Ukraine until now has been one of the finger pointing at Ukraine. It's up to Ukraine to deal with this. Of course, the onus has to be on the source of the corruption, the country itself. But to say that there's no responsibility on our part, whether it's European governments hosting that corruption, European and Western banks allowing that corrupt money to come into Europe and the US to buy property, the use of Western consultants, lawyers and such like. All of that is also different aspects of the facilitation of that corruption. And if you don't close that down, you won't be successful in completely fighting corruption in Ukraine either. The two are very much interconnected. Unfortunately, that's not how it's been viewed until now, because everybody likes to point the finger at somebody else and say it's their problem, not ours. It doesn't work like that in the real world, especially in a world which is globalized, where money transfers are easily done, and where you have such cases of offshore money. And that, of course, is continuing, regardless of the establishment of new institutions in Ukraine, the latest scandal being how is it possible for Yulia Tymoshenko, whose official e-declaration to the National Agency for Prevention of Corruption for both 2016 and 2017 gives her an annual income of about $22,000 to $35,000, and yet she's able to spend $780,000, over $750,000, on a US consultant in Washington, Avenue Strategies. There's obviously a discrepancy somewhere. And this is a big issue in Ukraine at the moment. The National Anti-Corruption Bureau is investigating Tymoshenko for this. But the problem isn't just with Tymoshenko. The problem is that in Washington, this is dirty money that's been accepted without any due diligence. If Tymoshenko and her Batkivshina party don't have the resources to pay $780,000, then this money must be coming from some opaque, non-transparent source, probably offshore bank accounts which have not been declared. And therefore it's illegal both in Ukrainian law and in US law. So the examples are many, and the hypocrisy is just mind-blowing. Until that hypocrisy is resolved, there's no moral right for people who have been involved in that hypocrisy to continue pointing their fingers. Deal with the hypocrisy, stop being involved in the corruption, and then be my guest, complain about Ukraine and other countries in the world. Until then, I recommend making a cup of tea and keeping quiet. Thank you.